Like and subscribe, join the Discord. Now let's dive. Meriwether Lewis is a name that stands out as iconic in American history. He is the first half of the famed duo Lewis and Clark that surveyed the rugged landscape on behalf of Thomas Jefferson, who just conducted the Louisiana Purchase. A brave man setting out into unknown lands with an extremely large chance of dying. The landscape was dotted with territorial tribes, and sickness and hunger were real enemies. But as we all likely know, the trip was a success. Lewis and Clark managed to map much of the new American territories, make contact with various tribes, and expand the reach of America further across this massive continent. The team traveled over 8,000 miles, seeing things that no other man of the West had ever dreamed of. And when Lewis and Clark and their team eventually returned, they were heroes to the American people, with Thomas Jefferson himself, the president at the time, bestowing massive wealth on each of them. And for Lewis, this meant he was appointed the governor of the new Upper Louisiana Territory, and he also got a 1,600-acre estate. And so, for Lewis, that's about where his story ends. He lived out his life peacefully and extremely wealthy, as he had already come from a lot of money. Or so it should have been. Lewis may have been personal friends with the president, but that definitely does not mean he had the best relationship with the government as a whole. And because of this, Lewis was requested to make the trip all the way from Louisiana to Washington so that he could give a statement about the expenses he had incurred during the trip. Basically, the government was saying, hey, we don't believe you needed to buy these things, so now you have to prove that you needed to buy these things. Which is ridiculous when you think about it. What kind of paperwork is this guy gonna have when he was out in the middle of nowhere? And yet the government still demanded he come. So Lewis was a little bit stressed out, understandably, when he set out on his trip. It's not like he had all of his cheeseburgers notarized. And so, as he made this trip, he began thinking, oh my goodness, is this gonna bankrupt me? Because now I'm gonna have to pay for everything. And this was the mindset he had along his many hundreds of miles long trek when he made an infamous stop at a place known as Grinder's Stall, which was essentially an inn named after the Grinder family. And it's at this very place where Lewis's life would change permanently. All of what we know that night comes from one woman's testimony, that being Priscilla Grinder. And the first testimony she gave is as follows. Lewis arrived at her inn on October the 10th, 1809, with a pack of horses, a few servants, and a request to stay the night. Lewis had been traveling along with his companions across the Natchez Trace, which is a 450-mile trail through the middle of the forest and other really dangerous barren lands at the time. It connects Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee. And it's the kind of journey one doesn't relish having to take because it's one, long, and two, there were still tribes out in a lot of these places who really did not like this new American people very much. Priscilla continues her story by saying that Lewis entered the home erratically after he was given permission. And before he had walked through the door, he immediately dismissed his servants, telling them to stay in the stables with the horses. Lewis would then spend most of his evening pacing around the room while he waited for Priscilla to serve dinner, at which point he ate a couple of mouthfuls and then began erratically yelling at himself in what she calls a violent manner. And then suddenly, he stormed off to his room. And Priscilla thought, kind of a weird guy, but hey, probably not the weirdest thing she's seen. That wasn't until later in the evening when she heard him continue pacing. Now at this point, it was very, very late at night, early morning, and Priscilla began to hear very strange things upstairs, continuing talking to himself, more pacing, until suddenly, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a gunshot ring out upstairs. In addition to the gunshot, Priscilla heard a man yell out the words, "Oh Lord." And this was enough for Priscilla. She decided to rush upstairs to see what was going on, and through a little peephole into Lewis's room, she saw the following scene. Lewis was sitting in a chair, it's believed, bleeding out with half of his forehead missing, screaming for Priscilla to bring water to heal his wounds. And evidently Priscilla was not the empathetic type, as she completely ignored his request and went back downstairs. I really don't know why. And I think we can all agree that that's an incredibly weird reaction to take. And yet she did take it. She went to bed, and that night, Lewis, she probably presumed, would pass away. But the next morning when Lewis's servants arrived to wake him up to get on their journey, they found Lewis in his room still alive, with not one, but 2 gunshots. One apparently had broken his forehead wide open, and the other one went right into his abdomen, tore his torso apart, and exited out his back, right past the backbone. In addition to that, Lewis was also covered in razor marks, like he had been cut a bunch of times. And it seems that Lewis was blessed with an incredible gift of strength. It's what allowed him to conduct the insanely difficult journey, which was the Lewis and Clark expedition, but it's also what allowed him to survive 2 gunshot wounds and countless knife attacks, along with hours of bleeding unattended, which is insane to think about. But it seems that even with all this strength, Lewis himself knew that the end was near for him, and when his servants walked into the room, he would repeatedly beg them to put him out of his misery. But the servants declined, and Lewis would continue to bleed out for several more hours. And this is where things get very interesting, because the first person to get word of this outside of Lewis and his friends who were there, and obviously the innkeepers, a federal agent by the name of Nellie happened to be walking along the same trail about 2 days behind Lewis and his crew. So when Nellie comes up to this inn seeking to take a break from his long journey, he finds out that a very mysterious man had booked a night here and then had passed away under very strange circumstances. Nellie quickly grasped how serious of a situation it was, considering that it was Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition who was still famous at this time. And Nellie, instead of conducting an investigation, did something very, very interesting. He took down Priscilla's testimony, didn't ask anyone else really for theirs, and then proceeded to write a letter to Thomas Jefferson that Lewis had taken his own life, and then he proceeded to bury Lewis in a random hole in the middle of nowhere. And that was obviously with no investigation, no autopsy, and no further questioning. And it's because of this man's word that we still have this idea that Lewis took his own life. And here's where things are going to get very, very, very strange if they weren't already. Since there was no actual evidence that Lewis had done this to himself, we have to then look at the other possible evidence that people have claimed over the years, and most of that falls down onto Lewis's mental state. Now, it's very hard to get a grasp on what was going on with Lewis. Some think he might have had a disease like malaria, and that was affecting his mind, but what we do know is that he would have bouts of depression. And coupling this with the fact that he thought he was going to have to deplete a huge amount of his money paying for this trip's expenses, he was probably a little frustrated. It's crazy to think that this extremely wealthy and famous man would take his own life because he had to pay a little bit of expenses to the government. Now, we don't know how much it would have been, but we know it would not have bankrupted him whatsoever. He was also best friends with the president, so he could have worked something out. And it's also worth noting that although he had a history of depression, he also had a history of absolutely loving life and was known as quite the man. So that's where the argument that Lewis had taken his own life gets really flimsy, because there's no real evidence. But on the inverse, there's a lot of evidence that it was not him who took his own life. So let's dive into that end of this mystery. The testimony that I gave to you from Priscilla was only the testimony she said the first time. She never again repeated it quite the same. In fact, 30 years later, she would be in a school classroom. People were asking her about the events of that night. And when the teacher said, "Hey, Priscilla, can you recount that night's events for us?" she gave a very, very different story. In this new tale, there were 3 men who appeared to be chasing Lewis through this trail, seeking to catch him. And when Lewis and his crew pulled up to this inn seeking help, she let them all inside and then closed the door. Lewis was in a very erratic mood, which remains true in this story based on what I can tell. So she had to take his gun from him, and when these people came to the door, she took the Draco from him and pointed it outside and shot him. No, I'm kidding. She took the gun from Lewis and then pointed it at all of them and warned them to leave, otherwise she would shoot. And evidently this worked to some extent, but we might have reason to think otherwise because of what later would happen to Lewis. It's also worth noting that Priscilla added this strange detail that she had seen Lewis's servant walking around outside late in the night wearing the clothes that Lewis had arrived in. And the servant would become a massive suspect in this case until he died of an alleged suicide 9 months later. Now, this is all admittedly weird, and I think we can all agree on that, whether or not you think Lewis took his own life, but it even gets stranger from here. You have to remember that Lewis was chosen for this expedition for many reasons, one of which being that he was an expert woodsman and marksman. And in YouTube-friendly terms, he's the kind of guy that would know when hunting how to hit something so it wouldn't be in torment for several hours on end, bleeding out. And I think that's a really, really important piece of information to take into mind, because why would he have had to have shot himself twice? And then also tried stabbing himself multiple times over the course of hours. And if trying to take his own life, why would he cry out for help for someone to heal him and his wounds? Nothing really adds up there. I also want to add the idea that I've shot a couple guns, and reloading does take time. That's especially true when you're talking about a flintlock revolver. Could you imagine having your face falling off, or a giant hole through your whole body going out your back? Having to reload by hand a flintlock weapon? That's ridiculous. And it also doesn't help that Lewis's mother herself would go on record stating to many people that she is 100% certain that Lewis did not take his own life. So the man's mother doesn't even think it's possible. And I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but it does still get crazier from here. In 1848, Almost 40 years after Lewis perished, the government felt kind of bad that this American hero was just rotting in some random hole in the middle of nowhere. So they're like, oh, maybe we should build him a monument. And in order to build this commemorative monument, they actually had to exhume a portion of Lewis's body so that they could properly build and place him under the monument. And as it so happens, there was a practicing medical doctor there to witness the exhuming of the body to make sure everything went along smoothly. And while exhuming Lewis's remains, this doctor got a great look at the whole body and proceeded to go on the record telling everybody that the bullet wound was in the back of the head. Not quite the story we were told. And unless your last name was, that means that someone else was very much so likely there and did this to Lewis rather than himself, which is what the entire committee that was in charge of exhuming Lewis's body said. They believe that, and I quote, "It seems more probable that he died by the hands of an assassin." So you would think at this juncture, let's just put our heads together. Yeah, this Lewis dude was 100% murdered. He did not take his own life. But no, we even let the medical opinion slide. There are so many rabbit holes within this very same mystery that you can go down, from the fact that Lewis was involved in cutting up some illegal operations for giving illegal mining claims, and how someone was probably a little bit angry about that and very much wanted to kill Lewis. That's just a known fact. Or you can just discuss the host of rivals who wanted Lewis's position and the benefits that came with it, but throw all of that aside. What I think is really interesting is that multiple times people have petitioned the government to be able to exhume Lewis's body to get once and for all the final statement on what's going on. And the federal government has blocked it every time, both the exhuming of the body and an autopsy, most recently stating in 2009 that it would set a bad precedent if they did that. I wonder what the precedent would be, that maybe we shouldn't murder American heroes? I don't know. But it's a very interesting rabbit hole, and I want to talk about this for a while. I truly believe that there needs to be an investigation done here, because the fact that this guy was murdered and it's been framed as a suicide for over 200 years, that just doesn't sit right with me. This man still has family alive today, and I think that truly Lewis deserves much better than he's gotten. But let me know what you guys think, as this is quite possibly one of America's oldest mysteries. The Winchester House. This is an interesting footnote in American history. There are few families and names as iconic as Winchester. This is the family that has brought us some of the most famous firearms in history. Winchester is a name synonymous with modern ingenuity. But this isn't quite about them. In fact, this is about one specific woman in that family. So let's take it back to where this all began. William Wirt Winchester was the founder of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. On September 30th, 1862, William married his sweetheart Sarah. They were longtime friends and had fallen in love with each other, and they even grew up next to each other, which is pretty sweet. By all accounts, it was a wonderful match. They got along great and everyone was happy. However, things would begin to shift for the family in a very negative pattern. In 1866, William and Sarah had a baby, but it would die during childbirth. And this totally seemed to shift their two mindsets. In fact, for quite a long time, the two just decided to leave society behind. And instead, the two focused on the building of their new home on Prospect Hill. It would take 2 years and would be completed in 1868. It was 20,000 square feet, had 20 rooms, and was quite literally a dream home. It's incredible. But most important is that during this time, Sarah and William, but most importantly Sarah, would pick up a love for architecture and architectural design. But like I said, this pattern of losing family members would only begin in 1866, and it wouldn't end for many decades, until in 1881, William himself would die, leaving Sarah a young widow. And it seems that this event, to many people's accounts, shattered both her heart and her mind. After the reading of the will, Sarah became one of the most wealthy people in America, owning almost all of the stock of the Winchester Company and coming into an inheritance worth many millions, and today possibly multiple billions. But along with this inheritance, Sarah got quite a different and darker one. She began going to seances, and during that time was told while communicating with the demonic that it was her fault for every person who was killed using a Winchester firearm. And Sarah, being a recently widowed woman who's lost children and who had lost the majority of her really close family relatives and friends, took that in stride, and not in a good way. She would spend the rest of her life believing that the spirits of the dead were tormenting her and living in her mind and chasing her, and all sorts of really horrifying things to think about. And so Sarah took a very strange course through the rest of her life. She decided to spend $12,750 to purchase a small home in 45 acres in California. And from there she would begin building and building and building. endlessly, it seems. And it's gonna be difficult to encapsulate just how weird this is, but Sarah's fascination with this home was very, very different. For nearly 40 years, she continued to extend upon her home, building more and more strange and elaborate rooms. And with each new extension to this place, the distance between her and reality seemed to stretch further and further, to the point it was utterly ludicrous. Doors would open into walls, staircases would go to nowhere, and there were even fully furnished rooms covered up with each new iteration, which to this day still haven't been all uncovered. But even stranger, Winchester drew up all of these plans herself. She decided that she wanted complete creative control, but she also wanted to make sure that there was no evidence or any map of where the rooms were left for anybody. So we have a completely unmapped, no blueprinted house. Or so it seems to be, ostensibly, that's what she wanted. In reality, the reason is quite a bit darker. Sarah built the house like this not to encapsulate anything, but rather to escape something. Those being the people she thought were living in her head and following her around. Sarah is known to have believed that adding each of these rooms was helping her escape from these people that were in her mind, and that's just so sad. And this all began because one evil woman told her that she was being possessed by people who were killed using the firearms that were created by her company. Which is ludicrous, but yeah, Sarah bought it, and for 40 years she would live in this torment. And it's really hard to think that a feat of architecture this beautiful could be housing something as dark as a woman trying to escape her own mind. But it's true, the house is gorgeous. If you were to walk through it, you might begin to notice odd things. Rumor has it that Sarah has an obsession with the number 13. For instance, the home has 13 chandeliers, bathrooms, hooks, robes, etc., things like that, strewn about it. But perhaps even more strange is that Sarah, while still alive, would let some news drop. That being that she had left a completely furnished room filled with some incredibly expensive things, including a Tiffany window she had custom designed, hidden somewhere in her house. Now mind you, like I said, there are walls built into doors blocking everything, so half the rooms aren't even accessible, and you have entire new buildings built on top of it. So there are possibly dozens of rooms we have no idea about, and this is one of them. And what's very interesting is that in 2016, what was uncovered was a room that was fully furnished that included Victorian couches, that included these strange but beautiful organs, paintings, and even a sewing machine and one of those dress mannequin things. It's pretty incredible, and it was like a time capsule into a totally different era. And yet I can only imagine that this is one of many hiding in this home. Not to mention that we don't even know if there are more substructures for this house because there's no blueprints. For all we know, there could be miles of tunnels, or possibly even something stranger hidden beneath that house. I don't know, but I also want to add another interesting detail to end this. The home is now 4 stories tall, but it was originally 7. Those 3 tiers were removed though after they were damaged in a hurricane. I just think it's worth showing this photo because it's absolutely gorgeous what this home looked like in its heyday. And it's admittedly magnificent, I can't lie, it's just stunning. But it's also so strange that it hides one of the darkest secrets about one of America's most prominent families, right beneath its beautiful facade. Those were 2 admittedly very interesting mysteries, but this one's going to keep you on your toes. The case of the disembodied feet is one of the greatest examples of failures of law enforcement I have ever encountered. And while technically this is going to be a multinational mystery, some of it happens in Canada, but we're going to let that slide because a huge portion of it does occur in America. And it begins with the simple fact that since 2007, 21 dismembered feet have shown up on the shores of Vancouver in Washington state. But don't worry, without any evidence, the police say that there's no foul play involved, so yeah, nothing to worry about. Obviously I'm being sarcastic because anyone with a noggin would think, that doesn't sound right. On August 20th of 2007, there was a girl walking along the shoreline minding her own business when she saw what she describes as a blue and white Adidas sneaker just sitting there on the shoreline. Upon approach, she had that inner feeling that something was awry, and when she picked up the shoe, she was horrified to find a human foot inside of it. I'm not even kidding. To be precise, it was a decaying right male foot in a size 12 shoe in case you misplaced yours. And if this were a one-time incident, yes, it would be weird, and I get it. Sometimes these things happen, man. Everyone loses a foot. But it's happened 20 more times since then, with the second time occurring just 6 days later when another size 12 appeared on what is known as Gabriola Island, which is about 30 miles away from the previous shoe discovery. Inside, once again, was another decaying male foot. If you misplaced yours, it was in a black and white Reebok. May 22nd, 2009, there was a shift though. It was actually a female right foot found on Kirkland Island, and it was in what is described as a blue and white New Balance shoe, which very interestingly was still tied up with the foot inside, obviously. And then on June 16th, also of 2009, two hikers on West Ham Island found a left foot, which allegedly matches the right foot that was found 5 months earlier. August 1st, a right male foot is then found in Pisht, Washington. And it really does keep going. The last one I'll read for you guys though is November 11th of 2009. Again, a woman's left foot is found in another New Balance shoe. Seems like we have a trend here. The list does go on for many more people, and might even still be growing based on what we know. But I won't bore you with a super long list. What's more intriguing to me is that some of these shoes have been posthumously attached to their owners. For instance, the first shoe connects to a woman who allegedly jumped off a bridge. And then another is linked to a man who supposedly suffered from depression and had been missing since 2004. You can see the connection that the feds are trying to make there. And then there's this other case, which was of a boot that was discovered rather than a shoe. And the feds managed to connect that all the way back to a fisherman who, as far as I'm aware, was not on board a boat at that time, but he went missing at some point in 1985. I dare say it's very odd that all these people disappeared under strange circumstances or had taken their own lives, allegedly, in different places across Canada and America over the course of over 30 years, and yet all of their shoes with their foot inside ended up in the exact same vicinity. But don't worry guys, like I said, the police have it under control. There's no signs of foul play, except for the missing feet. But what does get me most about all of these descriptions I've read is that they all use the word foot, not something like bone or foot bones. They just say foot. And I'm led to believe that that means that the rest of the skin and flesh was still on there, but I don't know. I could be misreading that. This could be a lack of precise language. But it seems that across every single one of these articles I've read, they all say foot. I don't know. I really want to see what the police report says, but I couldn't find them, and they're Canadian, so who knows. But this all to say that maybe there's something deeper going on here. If these feet were still attached to the bones and they were found in the shoe, that would cause a whole nother rabbit hole to go down here. But you might be asking yourself, how could the police possibly think this was foul play? I have the same question. What their evidence relies on almost entirely is the fact that the foot, where it's severed, doesn't show any signs of man-made tools or, like a saw or something like that. But once again, the astuteness of the feds does baffle me here, because no one ever in history has ever staged something to look like they didn't do it, especially when it comes to a crime, like taking someone's life. And it's also not like if these shoes and feet were in the water for as long as the police say they were, something could have taken a couple nibbles out of the top of them. I don't know. But I do think it's very odd that the police are so adamant that there's no foul play, despite 21 feet being found and only a couple of them being matches. It also begs the question, where's the rest of them? All this is to say that there's a very real possibility that something darker is at play, and the fact that no one's truly investigated this as a possible serial killer is ridiculous. You have a bunch of feet showing up on the ground. What are you doing? And I want to add that they've only managed to pair up 3 of the feet to their owners over the course of 20 years almost that they've had these feet showing up. It's just all a little too ridiculous for me. But what really ties the knot for me is that all of these shoes that were found are in pristine condition, considering that they've been in the ocean for years in some cases. Now, all the shoes on screen right now were in the ocean for anywhere from 2 to 4 years. You can't tell me those look like shoes that have been swimming around for 2 to 4 years. But what really gets me about this story, and why I think there's 100% something else going on, is this shoe I'm showing you on screen now is from a body of a person that allegedly went missing in 1985 and was found in 2011. That does not look like the shoe of someone who has been missing for 26 years and has been adrift and suffering the elements of nature. It makes no sense. So without a doubt, I think something's going on, but I'll be curious to know what you guys think down below. All right, guys, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. It's a little bit of a different twist. It is 4th of July, so I'm trying to spend some time with family, but I also had to, get out my video for my other family online. And I just want to say thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed this new twist. I really, really appreciate it. Hope you guys all enjoy 4th of July, especially Canada, the new 51st state. I'm just kidding. I hope you guys really all do have a great day. I think we're going to be streaming tonight, the day this video comes out. So if you want to, please make sure to check it out. But I also want to say thank you guys for everyone subscribing. Everything's going like crazy. I'm just so grateful for you guys. I appealed the copyright strike. We'll know about it soon. Just overall, thanks guys. I also want to say a quick shout out to everyone on the Discord. Make sure to join. I also want to say a quick shout out to Paul. Thank you for all the support and for carrying on the Patreon. It really does mean the world. And just special thank you, Paul. I hope you guys are all doing well. Have a great 4th of July. Try not to to blow off your hands. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see each and every one of you in the next one. Boom!